Hello Varlets, it's finally back. Weapon reviews are making a return on my channel after a long break. This was mostly because other content took priority over it, and that the game has changed quite a bit since I introduced them. With the talent tree update, things like breakpoints and build recommendations became a lot harder to do, and so I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what I wanted my weapon reviews to become. In the end, I decided that these reviews will be more focused on the damage profiles and mechanics of the weapon, moving away from build recommendations since it's pretty hard to give a recommendation when the talent tree plays such a big role in the performance of the weapon. So, without further ado, today we'll be looking at the quick draw revolvers in Darktide. We'll be reviewing both the revolvers, the heavy-hitting Zarona and the fan-firing Agripinaa, seeing how they perform individually and comparing how they perform against each other. Let's kick things off with the weapon stats section of the review. Both the revolvers share the same weapon stats, consisting of a damage stat which affects your base damage, a penetration stat which affects your armor damage modifiers or ADM, mobility which affects your movement capabilities like your available dodges on a weapon, reload speed which of course affects reload speed, and a critical bonus stat which affects the critical damage modifier and your weapon's critical chance. Mobility is your dump stat here. As long as you can meet the maximum dodge count of 4 dodges, which is around 50%, that's really all the mobility you'll need from the revolver. Everything else, you'll want as high as you can get, especially for both damage and penetration. These two stats form the core foundation of your damage profile, and if you had to pick between a higher penetration stat or a higher critical bonus, I'd go with having more penetration since you'll have ways to tweak your critical chance. Next up, let's take a look at the revolvers individually by looking at their damage profile. Thanks to mods and some math, I'm now able to calculate the maximum potential of the weapon when all relevant stats are at 80%. No need to burn through dockets trying to roll for one. Of course, because of rounding errors, the numbers here won't be exactly 100% accurate, but will be good enough to make for some good analysis. Starting with the Zarona's damage profile. Off the bat, the Zarona boasts some pretty strong damage numbers. Its body shots are pretty hard hitting, but its weak spots and critical hits are where this weapon's strengths reside. Going for headshots nearly doubles your damage with a 1.9 multiplier, except against Unyielding and Carapace. Scoring a critical hit more than doubles it with a 2.35 multiplier, again with the exception against Unyielding and Carapace armor. What this tells us is that body shot crits are worth more than landing headshots. So, if you are ever in a situation where you can guarantee a crit but can't go for a headshot for any reason, landing a body shot is perfectly alright if not better. Of course, if you can guarantee a crit and land a headshot, go for that since the damage output for that attack is pretty crazy. In fact, if you compare the Zarona's damage profile against weapons like the plasma gun's primary attack and the bolter, you'll find that it can hit harder than either of those weapons. While being able to fire more than 5 shots before needing to reload is a benefit, it does make you wonder about how a bullet is capable of dishing out more damage than a molten blob of plasma or a mini rocket launcher round. Food for thought. Anyway, let's take a look at the other weapon characteristics. First off, the Zarona has a fall-off start range of 13.5 meters and gradually loses up to 20% damage against all armor types until 35.5 meters. As a ranged weapon, it has a pretty good reach considering the damage fall-off and the distance you have to work with. This makes it a good sniper of a weapon. High alpha damage and relatively low fall-off means you can expect to have a pretty consistent experience with the Zarona at picking off far-away targets. However, it also has an interesting feature. The Zarona has a sniper mechanic built in. This means it actually starts to gain damage the further you are away from your target. The catch? It only applies to Carapace armor as noted in the penetration stat. While it has fall-off damage against every other armor type, against Carapace armor you actually gain more damage the further away you are. This sniper bonus kicks in at 13.5 meters and provides you with an increasing damage bonus against Carapace, to the tune of up to 24% that caps out at 35.5 meters, literally the reverse of its regular damage fall-off. Furthermore, the Zarona is capable of penetrating enemies with its shots. How many enemies you can pierce depends on their mass or how thick they are. So, for something like Poxwalkers, which have very little mass, a single shot can easily punch through 5 of them, whereas for something more durable like Drake Rages, you can only pierce through 2 of them. For heavily armored enemies like Crushers, Maulers, and Rages, you won't be able to penetrate through them at all. This, along with its quick draw capability, makes the Zarona a very good weapon for taking out priority targets even if they are in between enemies. Excellent for dealing with specials mixed in with hordes. The main downside of the Zarona is probably its long reload and relatively limited ammo pool, both acting as a balancing factor given its lethality and flexibility as a weapon. With the Zarona covered, let's take a look at the Agripinaa XIV next. Diving straight into its damage profile, we see that the Agripinaa hits hard, but not as hard as the Zarona. The Agripinaa Revolver has about 30% less base damage than the Zarona, but gets an additional 58% more ammo to work with. It's also interesting to see that the Agripinaa receives a 1.25 multiplier against unarmored and infested enemies over its base damage. On top of that, the Agripinaa deals more unyielding damage than the Zarona. It's not by much, but this makes it a pretty strong weapon against Ogrin enemies and monsters. And while its critical hit multiplier is overall slightly lower than the Zarona, the multiplier against unyielding is also higher. Combining this with the increased rate of fire of about 50% while fanning the hammer, the Agripinaa is capable of doing a respectable job as a monster DPS weapon. However, the drawbacks of this weapon does curtail its strength, and that is its fall-off range and damage loss. The Agripinaa Revolver has a fall-off range that starts closer and ends sooner than the Zarona. Starting from 10.5 meters onwards, the Agripinaa Revolver experiences damage fall-off up until 25.5 meters, which is 10 meters shorter than the Zarona. The real kicker to this is just how dramatic the damage fall-off is, and it depends on the armor type you are shooting at. Here is the table for that. As you can see, it suffers from pretty steep damage fall-off in a span of just 15 meters, causing it to lose almost, and in some cases, over 50% of its damage. However, it suffers the least against flag armor, making it an okay weapon for dealing with shooters and gunners at a distance. Unfortunately, unlike the Zarona, the Agripinaa has absolutely no penetration power. Where the Zarona can pierce through between 2 to 5 enemies depending on mass, the Agripinaa's bullets are stopped by even a single Poxwalker or Groaner. This makes it not as strong as the Zarona in dealing with priority targets mixed in with hordes, but also means you might end up spending more ammo to accomplish what the Zarona can do with one shot if it gets collateral kills, reducing some of the ammo benefits the Agripinaa has over it. Putting everything together, the Agripinaa XIV Revolver is a weapon that excels in a very particular niche of monster DPS, but is overall worse than its Zarona counterpart in pretty much everything else. So, comparing the revolvers together, why would you pick the Agripinaa over the Zarona? The Agripinaa works best if you want to have an offensive, close quarters combat style with okay range capabilities. The main draw of the weapon is its fan firing ability, allowing you to rapidly dump 5 rounds into an enemy or several, and then rapidly reload it with a speed loader. Built correctly, you can dispatch shooters pretty quickly without worrying about suddenly being caught out without much ammo left in the chamber. In fact, because of its reload speed and fire rate, the Agripinaa technically has a very high sustained DPS, all things being equal. The Zarona, on the other hand, is basically a mini bolter, except it hits harder and can be drawn out much faster. High enemy penetration and high damage makes it a very good problem solver, removing targets when you need to and can do so on the fly. Not to mention, the Zarona's shots can go through your allies, meaning you won't be blocked by your friendly Ogrin accidentally getting in the way. This is something the Agripinaa also struggles with and is a real problem for the weapon. At this point in the video, I'd normally put my build recommendations here, but because the builds for everyone can differ, it's pretty hard to give anything concrete that would apply to all scenarios. Instead, I'll offer you the perks, blessings, and talents that synergize well with the purpose of the weapon, giving you some loose guidelines about how you might want to proceed to build your ideal revolver. Regardless of which revolver you choose, critical chance is very strong given its crit multipliers, so blessings like Point Blank, Crucian Roulette, and Surgical are strong considerations to pick up. Personally, I pick Surgical above all else because it can guarantee a critical hit if you aim long enough. Because of the inherent critical chance of the revolver, you will never need more than 8 stacks of Surgical to guarantee a hit if your critical bonus is high enough. Crucian Roulette might be good for the Agripinaa if you really want to build into spamming the Fan Fire at all times. Point Blank can pair well with either revolver if you intend to use it more as a defensive countermeasure in a melee-centric build. Given how you'd want to prioritize critical chance, picking up Hand Cannon, which allows you to rend through armor, makes it a very strong choice. This blessing essentially makes up for the only armor type the revolvers are weak against, Carapace armor. Depending on your class and build, you can easily two-shot maulers with either revolver when you have the blessing. If you really lean into it, you can even one-shot crushers with the Zarona. Having a mix of critical chance and hand cannon rounds out the potential of the weapon, letting it shine more consistently in most scenarios, to the best of its ability of course. For perks, as I lean into building a more rounded out revolver, I take Carapace damage to further improve its potential in an area that can really make use of the damage. For the Agripinaa specifically, it can make use of unyielding damage with its damage profile, further leaning into the monster DPS role. Beyond this, it's hard to give proper perk recommendations without knowing how it performs given your talent loadout. You'll just have to see if an additional 25% damage to a specific armor type is going to push you to a new breakpoint. As for talents, depending on the class you play, there might be some ways to help improve the performance of the Revolvers in one way or another. If you are a veteran, taking Kill Zone can help the Agripinaa Revolver a lot. The additional 15% base damage can compensate for its steep damage fall-off, letting you get in more effective shots from further away. The same can be said for Long Shot. In contrast to this, if you are a Zealot, picking up Anointed in Blood leans into the Agripinaa's close range strength with its Fan Fire, dealing more damage the closer you are to the enemy. Pairing this with Duelist allows you to make the Agripinaa Revolver a very lethal defensive weapon. Firing it as soon as you dodge an attack and fanning the hammer is going to put most enemies into the dirt in an instant. Anything that increases critical chance will not be out of place either, so talents like Deadshot, Weapon Specialist, Blazing Piety, and Scryer's Gaze can help push up the performance of the Revolvers. This is especially the case if you add other finesse talents like Marksman's Focus and Disrupt Destiny to really highlight the damage potential of the Revolvers. With that, this weapon review comes to an end. Revolvers are in a strange place in the current sandbox in my opinion. I think there is some tuning to be done to give them a more proper fit into our arsenal, instead of being something that competes with other weapons in a way that doesn't quite make sense. I won't go into tweaks for the Zarona in this review, but I will say that the Agripinaa Revolver should at least have the capability of penetrating one enemy, similar to the Zealots throwing knives. This would help it a lot in terms of performance and actually have its bigger ammo reserves be more impactful. I would even go so far as to say that Fat Shark should lean further into the Fan Fire fantasy of the Agripinaa. I would tweak the damage profile of the Agripinaa, increasing its body shot damage slightly, but reducing its weak spot and crit multipliers. This further separates the role of the Revolvers, with the Zarona being the more long-range sniper weapon, and the Agripinaa better fulfilling the role of a close-range burst DPS weapon. Then, I would increase the reserve ammo by 50%, so you can more freely utilize the full potential of the Fan Fire, instead of a single-shot fashion to be efficient with ammo. Because at this point, you're basically using a gimped Zarona, why not lean into the Fan Fire's strength? Let me know what you thought of this review video. I think it's more concise than the previous versions, but I also hope that it does a decent job at making the comparisons clear enough. In the meantime, I'll be working on more reviews with an eye to updating all my previous reviews into the current version of the game. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Varlets.